hello everyone. It is so good to see you. My name is Pastor Jason. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope Church, and I'm so thankful that you have chosen to worship with us again this morning. We're in the midst of a series called The Road to Redemption. It's about the Exodus, and specifically we're applying it to our lives in that God brings us out of situations and He brings us out of sin. He redeems us out of one place and redeems us to another place. And so if you're at the stage of life or you're in situations that you desperately need and seek and looking for the redemption of God, I really believe that God is going to speak to you through this time. So I'm so thankful that you are here today. This morning I was listening to the radio in the background as I was preparing, and there was an interesting story that came on the radio about two people named Chris. I believe the names were Chris and John. And they met in a rather unique way. They met in an airport terminal as both of them were stuck. Both of them were stuck because their layover flights have been, or their connecting flights had been canceled. And so they're in this runway. I'm sorry, they're in this. They're in this area that what do you call it? The concourse, the terminal. They're in the terminal. That's where they're at. They're in the terminal, and they're there in the terminal, and they begin talking about how they got to where they were. And as they begin talking, this young woman named Chris begins to break down and cry. And the reason she's breaking down and crying is she is on her way to her best friend's wedding. She's been looking forward to it for months, if not years, and she's going to serve as the maid of honor, but she's not going to be able to make the wedding because her connecting flight has been canceled and she can't get a seat on this flight. And so instead of being in the place with her best friend and the people that she loves and admires the most, she's stuck in an airport terminal in another city that she's not even from. She is, as some people would say, stuck in a place called bitterness. She is away from home. She's not where she wants to be, and everything seems to be falling apart. And if anybody has reason to be bitter, it is this young woman missing this event that she has prepared so long for. You may not find yourself in an airport terminal today, but you know what it's like to be in a bitter place. You know what it's like to be in a place that you didn't expect to be where you are, and you surely didn't expect to stay there for a long season, but you have found yourself in going from one place to another, but you seem to be stuck in a place called bitterness. That's what happened to Israel. Remember, Israel is leaving the land of bondage. They're leaving Egypt, and God has redeemed them out of that. He has just brought them across the Red Sea. He has given them victory over their enemies, and now Moses is leading God's people 3 days out in the wilderness. And when they get there, life becomes really, really bitter. Life is bitter when they get there for a couple reasons. The first reason it becomes bitter for them is because they have no food or water. But then something happens to make it even more bitter. Listen to these words as we read as we read Exodus chapter 15. Beginning in verse 22. It says, Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. Marah in Hebrew means bitter. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Then the Lord made them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes. He says, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. And then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. and they encamped there by the water. I want to talk about this morning what to do when you find yourself in bitter places. What do you do when you find yourself in a bitter place? Well, when we look at this passage, when we look at what happens in the life of Israel, I believe that there are 4 principles that we can learn about being in bitter places. And the truth is, if you're not in a bitter place right now, there's a good chance that you have just come out of a bitter place, and there's a good chance that you may someday go into a bitter place. So what do we know about what we ought to do when we find ourselves in bitter places? Let me just share with you 4 quick things. Number 1, when you find yourself in a bitter place, there's 4 things that you can find in bitter places. The first is this: God's people can often find themselves in bitter places. God's people often can find themselves in bitter places. And it doesn't matter what has happened in the past. It doesn't matter how well you prepared yourself. There are some times that you just find yourself in a bitter place, even if you've done everything right. This young woman, Chris, I was telling you about, she had done everything right to prepare for the wedding. She had made it to the airport on time. She had taken the right flight. She had gone to the right place, and the connecting flight wasn't available. And now she finds herself in a bitter place, not because she's done anything wrong, but because she's done things right. But things just did not work out the way that she wanted them to. That's what happens to Israel here. They have just crossed the Red Sea. They are feeling mighty because they have crossed this sea, and the sea has engulfed the Egyptians, and their enemy has been defeated. In fact, the first 21 verses of chapter 15, they're having a giant celebration, and they're worshiping God and proclaiming all the wonders and the goodness of God. But then the beginning of this verse, it says, "Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea." They were obedient to what Moses had asked them and commanded them and directed them to do. But even though they had done everything right, now they're finding themselves in a place where there's no food and no water. One of the things that we notice about the pandemic, as much as we think we have everything together, if people can't go to the grocery store for 3 days, it feels like society could break loose. And Chester makes the comment. He says Western civilization is about 3 days of empty grocery shelves away from social unrest. The only thing worse than not eating for 3 days is not having water for 3 days. Then Israel finds this source of water. They become elated because they're going to have something to drink. And when they drink the water is bitter. In fact, it's so bitter that they name the location bitter, Mara. They were parched, they were thirsty, they were wandering, they were hungry, and then when they finally have this water, the water they find is bitter. It's undrinkable. The truth is, sometimes you find yourselves in circumstances that are bitter. It may be a relational situation that has made you bitter. It may be a work scenario that has made you bitter. It may be a change in income or a change in your health that's made you bitter. Whatever it is, there is a time, from time to time, God's people find themselves, even if they've done everything right, in situations that they are bitter. God's people can find themselves in bitter places. The second thing we find out about bitter places is not just that God's people can find themselves in bitter places. The good news is that God's people can find relief in bitter places. Moses did the only thing that he could do in this scenario, and that is, it says that he cried out to God. And when he cried out to God, God said, listen, there's a log. I want you to go pick the log up. And I want you to throw the log into the water. And when the log was thrown into the water, all of a sudden the bitter water, it became sweet. There's some speculations about what has happened. One commentator, Buckingham, said that there were certain chemicals on the log, that when the log was thrown into the water, the log caused the toxins or the chemicals to go to the bottom of the water and the fresh water go to the top. So that when they drank the water, all the purified water was at the top, but all the bitter water went to the bottom. That's what one commentator would say. I wasn't there, so I can't prove what happened. I can prove this, though. I can tell you this. That the water was bitter, and God told Moses to throw the stick in the water, and when he threw the stick or the log in the water, all of a sudden, the bitter water becomes sweet. That God has this way of intervening in bitterness, of intervening in difficult circumstances, of intervening in a situation that is bitter and that is difficult and that can sometimes be destructive. And when God enters the picture and God inserts Himself and we follow what God commands, all of a sudden that situation that was bitter, the situation or the circumstances may not have been changed, but the results are completely different. That which was initially bitter has become sweet. Moses cried out to God, and God made it very clear. If you throw the stick into the water becomes sweet. And when he did that, the water became the best water imaginable. God has a way of providing relief in bitter places. At this point, their location did not change. Their circumstances didn't change. Their environment, should I say, didn't change. But God changed that which was bitter, and God made it sweet. Sometimes you and I find ourselves in bitter circumstances. And one of the things that we learn in bitter circumstances is that God can take that which is bitter and make it not only palpable, but can make it sweet. So in bitter places we find ourselves. In bitter places we find relief. Another thing that we find in bitter places is that God's people can find security in bitter places. Charles Spurgeon makes the comment that there are certain things that you and I learn in the wilderness that we can't learn anywhere else. In fact, Spurgeon would say this, if I can kind of paraphrase what he says. He says that the wilderness is the Oxford and the Cambridge of learning the hard lessons that for the believer. That there are some things you can only learn at Oxford and Cambridge, but the wilderness and bitterness is the Oxford and Cambridge oftentimes of God's people. While out here in the wilderness, they learned a phenomenally valuable lesson. That is that they could find security and hope in God. Let me show you how it happens. I'm going to read something to you in. Let me explain it this way. In Hebrew poetry, or in Hebrew writing, there is what people call a chiastic structure, or a chiasm. It's kind of difficult to explain, but it basically goes like this: because the Hebrew language was an audible language, people didn't read the language. Most people didn't read, but they heard and they memorized. What the writers of Hebrews, what the writers of the Scriptures would do, including Moses, is they would write in what is called a chiasm. And so basically, it's taking points and moving them toward an arrow. So for example, in this passage, he starts by saying, they found no water. And then the next statement is, and they came to Marah. And then the center of the argument was that they met God's decrees and laws. And then there's a parallel phrase that would say they came to Elam. And then finally they encamped they encamped near the waters. And so it is a memory device that has the most important point in the middle and then parallel points beside that. What we see in the middle of this, what the writer wants us to focus on is this: that God had given them the decrees and the laws, and by giving them the decrees and the laws, that they were going to be treated differently than the Egyptians as long as they were faithful to what God had commanded. Now I want to be clear about this. They were not. They were not. Let me think of a way to say this. Their obedience was a response because of what God had done. Let me read this to you, just so we kind of get this together. He says in verse 26, he says, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in His eyes, and give ears to His commands and keep His statutes," he says, "I will put on none of the diseases that I put on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Remember, to the Egyptians, God was the one that put the plagues on them. But here, the God that they saw put plagues on their enemies is going to be the God that brings healing to them. God is proving to them in this wilderness that they can trust Him and that God will heal them. And just as God healed this water and turned this water from bitter to sweet, so God will heal them and protect them and keep them as they wander in this wilderness and as they go into the promised land. What God seems to want to convince them of is that if they disobey and reject Him as their enemies had done, that they're going to get the same fate of their enemies. But if they obey Him in response to what He has already done, that God will prove Himself not as one that puts plagues on them, but rather one that heals them. It's been said that the first half of the book of Exodus is helping God's people get out of Egypt. Here we're seeing a transition. The first half of the book is helping God's people get out of Egypt. The second half of the book is helping Egypt get out of God's people. You're sitting there at home. You're watching this at the soccer field. You're in your car and you're going, "I don't think I know what Jason's talking about. Let me explain it to you." There was a great theological show called the Beverly Hillbillies. Y'all remember the Beverly Hillbillies, don't you? If you don't, I can tell you a little story about a man named Jed. He was a poor mountaineer and barely kept his family fed. But then one day he was out shooting some crude, and what coming down, bubbling crude. Oil that is black gold, Texas tea. And next thing you know, Jed's a millionaire. And kin folks said, "Jed, move away from there." They said, "California, Jed, is a place you want to be." So they loaded up the stuff and they moved to Beverly. The hills, that is, swimming pools and movie stars. And if you're my age or older, you know exactly what happened. The Beverly Hillbillies is a phenomenal show because it is about, as you just heard me describe it, it is about a family that has moved away from the hills to Beverly Hills, and they're out of the hills, they're out of the mountains, but the hills and the mountains are not out of them. And so the whole show is about the fact that they're in this affluent, sophisticated, contemporary city, but yet they still have all these backwoods ways that they simply have not gotten out of. They have left the hills, but the hills haven't left them. That's what's happening to Israel. Israel has left the bondage of Egypt. They've left some things behind, but the problem is they haven't quite gotten the Egyptian experience out of them. And they're taking with them some attitudes and some thoughts and some things from their past that they need to leave in the past. And God doesn't want to relate God does not want to relate to His people as one who inflicts, but rather one who heals. So He's trying to show His people here that God is going to be known. Verse 26 is the Lord your healer. That's one of those lessons that you can only learn in the wilderness. And because Israel learned it, they should be more secure now. They're recognizing that God did not bring them out into this desert to punish them or to leave them or to bring them this far only to take them this far, but that God is their healer. And the bitter circumstance they're facing, that God is going to heal that. He's going to remind them that He is their healer and that He has the ability to heal and protect His people. They get the security that they did not have before. One of the things we notice in these verses that Alexander notes is that whenever we see you in these verses, Alexander would say that the you is singular. That God is speaking to Moses. And He's basically telling Moses that if you do this, not you as in all God's people, but to start with Moses, that God will not bring these diseases on His people. There's an expression that I've heard recently that's kind of resonated with me. It says there is nothing more important that God is doing in any organization, whether it's a ministry or a family or an office or a team. There is nothing more important than God is doing than what He is doing in the heart of the leader. You want to see how healthy a family is? Ask what God is doing in the heart of the leader of that family. You want to see how effective a team is or an office is? It's usually only as effective and only as healthy as what God is doing in the heart of the person that is leading that organization. If Moses gets it wrong, all Israel is going to get it wrong. And so those of you that are responsible for other people, those of you that are leading other people and coaching other people and parenting other people and caring for other people, the most important thing God is doing in the lives of those you serve may be what God is doing in your very heart and my very heart. And God wants to give His people security. And in the wilderness and in the bitterness, God's people can find security. So as God's people are here in the wilderness or in the bitterness, they find themselves, they find relief, they find security, but ultimately they find redemption. And they not only find redemption, they find redemption to better places. In fact, God moves them from bitter to better. Listen how this story ends. Verse 27, it says, Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. God provided relief in at least two ways here. The first way He provided relief is He made the bitter water sweet, that God provided relief in their bitter circumstances, but He also provided relief from their bitter circumstances, because He takes them from this place to this place called Elim, where there are 70 palm trees, and they encamped by the water. There's 12 springs and 70 palm trees. If you're out in the desert and you see 12 springs and 70 palm trees, you know what that is? That's an indication not that the water is temporary, but that the water is secure, that the water is as permanent as it could be, that the water is a sustainable source. God takes them from the bitter place to the better place. But they can only appreciate the better place once they've spent a season in the bitter place. You know what? You might be in a season right now that is bitter. You might be in a season right now that you feel that nothing is going your way, that you get no sense of relief. When you do get a sense of relief, the sense of relief only turns out to be bitter. But God brings His people from bitter to better. But sometimes He leaves us in the bitter because we need to learn the lessons of the bitter. But once we learn the lessons of the bitter, then God takes us from the bitter to the better. God provides relief in circumstances, but He also provides relief from the circumstances. The previous seasons of bitterness you weren't in forever. God brought you out of them. And what you're going through right now, God is going to bring you out of as well. And I don't know when, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you this, that God can make the circumstances you're in a little less bitter. And I also know that God can remove you and take you and move you on from those circumstances as well. There are things that He moves you through, and then there are things that He moves you to. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place called bitter, but we don't have to be there forever. We see the last time we see this place, this desert of Shur, is in Genesis. Many of you know the story of Abraham. God has promised Abraham that he is going to be a father of many nations. And Abraham's wife Sarah was barren. And Abraham decided that he would follow the suggestion of Sarah. Sarah basically said to him, listen, I'm barren and I can't have children. I would like you to conceive with my maidservant. And Abraham doesn't object to it. Abraham has a relationship with this maidservant. The maidservant becomes pregnant. And as you can imagine, Sarah did not look favorably upon the maidservant being pregnant with her husband's child. Even though she was the one that suggested it, she became resentful toward Hagar, the maidservant. And so Hagar flees. And she goes into the wilderness. And as she's in the wilderness, as she's running away, the Lord comes and meets her in the wilderness in this very same desert of Shur. And He reveals Himself to her that He is the God that sees. And He basically tells Hagar that I see you, I see your pain, I know what you're going through, but I have a plan and a destiny for your life and for your son's life. And gave her the courage to go back and to face the situation that she was running from. She learned a valuable lesson in that bitter place. And here, hundreds of years later, God's people also learn a valuable lesson of being in a place called bitterness. In bitterness, we find ourselves. In bitter places, we can find relief. In bitter places, we can find security. We belong to God. In bitter places, we can also find redemption. Just because you're in a bitter place doesn't mean you have to stay in a bitter place. In fact, I began telling you the story of Chris and John in that bitter place of an airport terminal. As they began to sit there and talk, someone said to them, "You all, how long have you all known each other?" And John said, "We've known each other for 48 minutes." And Chris just sat there and began to cry, missing this wedding she wants to go to because she's stuck in a place called bitterness. John, moved with compassion, offers her his seat, his place, so that she can board the plane and go to the same city and be at the wedding that she had been waiting to go to for so long. He gave her a seat and a ticket out of bitterness, so she would not have to stay there forever. The reason we know this is true is because they've been married for 17 years. It's at this place called bitterness that God did something in both of their lives that would have never happened had He not brought them both to the place of bitterness. But because they both met in a place called bitterness, God took them to something that wasn't even on their minds when they arrived. It's terrible being in a place that's bitter. But sometimes God leads us there because it's a layover for some place that He's leading us to. God led Israel to a place of 70 palm trees and 12 springs. God led Chris and John to 17 years of marriage, 17 years and counting. Whatever bitter place that you're in today, I believe that God can make sweet, and I believe God can be using as a layover for some place that He's taking you in the future. Father, I thank You that You are a God that shows up in times that are bitter. And I thank You that You don't leave us in times that are bitter. Yes, Lord, we may have to stay there for a season. But Lord, You're a God that moves Your people from bitter to better. So Lord, I just want to lift up all those this morning that are going through seasons of bitterness. Would You make their bitter circumstances sweet? And would You move them from places that are bitter to places that are better? Father, we thank You and we look to You in the name of our healer. In the name of our healer, Jesus. Amen. Well, I want to thank you for being with us again. We have just really enjoyed having you with us in this series, and looking forward to seeing you next week. We do want to make you aware of a couple things. You can find out more about Hope Church by going to our website, www.hopeindayton.org. While you're there, you can give up your tithes or gifts and your offerings. You can also do that through our Hope in Dayton app that's available on the Apple App Store and also the Google Play Store. You can give through our text to give option. And of course, you can either mail it here or even better, bring it here. We'd love to see you on a Sunday morning at 10:15. Every Sunday at 10:15, we worship on campus, Wilmington Pk location here in Dayton, Ohio. And we worship with you online. And so we enjoy that as well. So whether it's in campus or online, we'd love to see you next week at 10:15. And until then, God bless.
Let me out of the desert, brought me into His streams, river of living water, turned my bitter into sweet, and all my burdens are lifted. He took the shackles off my feet. There's no sound louder than a captive set free. So let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Sing of His promises evermore. Pour out your thankfulness, let it overflow. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. There is joy in the morning, springing up in my soul.